The rain had been falling over the outer districts of the imperial city for hours, turning the narrow stone streets into rivers of silver beneath the lantern light, and most travelers had already hurried indoors, leaving the massive spaceport plaza nearly empty except for a few late workers and wandering merchants who packed their stalls for the night. Among them walked a human named Elias Carter, a quiet maintenance technician whose job mostly involved repairing cargo lifts and clearing debris around the landing bays. He was not famous nor powerful, and certainly not someone the elite citizens of the Empire would ever notice. But Elias had always believed in a simple rule his father taught him when he was young. If someone is in pain and you can help, you help. No questions asked. That belief was exactly what led him to hear the sound that would change his life forever. At first it was barely noticeable, just a faint whimper hidden beneath the sound of rain tapping against steel platforms. But Elias stopped walking immediately. He listened again. There it was, a small, frightened cry, high-pitched and trembling, like a child trying desperately not to be heard. His brow furrowed in concern as he followed the sound through a narrow service corridor that led behind one of the older docking towers. The corridor lights flickered dimly, reflecting off wet metal walls, and the crying grew clearer with every step. "Hey!" Elias called gently into the darkness, careful not to sound threatening. "Is someone there? You don't need to hide." The crying paused for a moment, then resumed even louder, filled with exhaustion and fear. Elias finally turned the corner and stopped in shock at what he saw. Sitting on the cold floor was a tiny dragon hatchling, barely the size of a large dog, its shimmering scales a deep sapphire blue that glowed faintly even in the dim light. Small wings trembled at its sides, and two delicate horns curved gently above its large, tear-filled eyes. The creature's claws clutched its own tail as if trying to comfort itself, and its body shook from both cold and distress. Elias blinked several times, trying to make sense of the situation. Dragons were not supposed to be here, especially not alone. In this empire, dragons were ancient, powerful beings, respected almost like living royalty. Even a hatchling would normally be surrounded by guards, attendants, and caretakers. Yet this little one was sitting alone in the rain-soaked corridor, crying quietly like a lost child. Elias slowly crouched down a few steps away so he wouldn't scare it. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice calm and warm. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon hatchling sniffled and lifted its head slightly, its golden eyes meeting his. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the human and the tiny dragon, both unsure of what would happen next. Elias could see fear in those eyes, but also confusion and loneliness. "You're freezing," he murmured, gently removing his worn work jacket and placing it on the ground in front of the creature. The hatchling hesitated, staring at the jacket as if unsure whether it was a trap, but the warmth of the fabric and the kindness in Elias's voice slowly broke through its fear. Carefully, it crawled forward and wrapped itself inside the jacket, letting out a tiny chirping sob as the warmth surrounded it. Elias felt his heart tighten at the sound. "There you go," he said quietly. "Better already, huh?" The hatchling nodded faintly, though it still trembled. Elias sat down cross-legged on the cold floor, keeping his movements slow and gentle so the little dragon wouldn't panic. "You're lost, aren't you?" he asked. The dragon didn't answer with words, of course, but its ears drooped and it lowered its head again. Elias sighed softly. Somewhere out there, someone had to be looking for this little one. But judging by how terrified it was, whoever had been responsible for it clearly hadn't been very kind. "Well," Elias said after a moment, offering a small smile, "until we figure out where you belong, you're safe here." The hatchling slowly crawled closer, still wrapped in the jacket, and after a moment it did something completely unexpected. It pressed its head against Elias's knee and let out a quiet, relieved chirp. Elias froze for a second, surprised that the dragon trusted him enough to get that close, but he carefully placed a gentle hand on its head and stroked the smooth scales. The dragon immediately relaxed under the touch, its trembling fading as it leaned into the warmth of the human's hand. What Elias didn't know, what absolutely no one in the city realized at that moment, was that this tiny crying dragon was not just any hatchling. It was the only child of the Dragon Emperor, the most powerful dragon ruler in the entire empire. Across the capital, royal guards and elite dragon riders were already searching frantically, their panic growing with every minute the heir remained missing. Entire districts were being sealed, fleets were preparing to scan the skies, and the dragon emperor himself had awakened from his ancient slumber in fury and fear. Yet the heir they were desperately searching for was not in danger at all. Instead, it was curled up peacefully beside a simple human mechanic in a forgotten maintenance corridor, slowly falling asleep while Elias gently comforted it like a father soothing a frightened child. The rain outside continued to fall, the imperial city continued its busy night, and the galaxy itself had no idea that the fate of an empire had just quietly shifted in a dim corridor where a human chose kindness instead of walking away. Dragon. The storm continued through the night, thunder rolling softly over the vast imperial city, while the lights of the spaceport flickered across the wet metal platforms. But inside the quiet maintenance corridor, warmth had finally replaced fear. The small dragon hatchling slept curled tightly inside Elias Carter's old work jacket, its tiny chest rising and falling with slow, peaceful breaths. For the first time in what must have been hours, the frightened creature looked calm. Elias leaned against the wall beside it, watching quietly with tired eyes. He still didn't understand how such a rare and powerful creature had ended up alone in a forgotten corridor, but one thing was clear to him. The little dragon needed comfort more than questions right now. Every so often the hatchling made soft chirping noises in its sleep, like a child having a bad dream, and Elias would gently pat its head until it relaxed again. "Easy there, little one," he murmured softly. "Whatever scared you, it's not here anymore." What Elias didn't realize was that far above the city, the sky had become a battlefield of urgency. Royal dragon riders soared between storm clouds, their massive wings cutting through rain and lightning, while glowing search beacons swept across the city below. The disappearance of the dragon emperor's only heir had thrown the entire empire into chaos. Imperial soldiers were sealing gates, scanning districts, and interrogating travelers, while powerful mages used ancient spells to track the faint magical signature of the missing hatchling. In the royal palace at the center of the capital, the dragon emperor himself stood upon the highest tower balcony, his enormous crimson form silhouetted against the storm. His glowing eyes burned with barely contained fury and fear. Across centuries he had ruled with absolute authority, yet nothing in his long life had prepared him for the terror of losing his only child. He extended his senses across the city again, searching desperately for the faint familiar energy of the hatchling. For a brief moment he felt it, a small flicker of dragon energy hidden somewhere near the outer spaceport. But strangely, the signal was calm, not frightened, not threatened. Confusion rippled through the ancient emperor's mind. Why would his lost child feel calm in such a dangerous place? Back in the quiet corridor, the hatchling slowly stirred as the storm thundered again. Its golden eyes opened sleepily, and it blinked at Elias, who was still sitting nearby. For a moment the little dragon looked confused, as if remembering the fear and loneliness from earlier. But when it saw the humans still there beside it, the tension melted from its tiny body. It crawled out of the jacket and waddled toward him on slightly clumsy legs before gently bumping its head against his arm. Elias chuckled softly. "Morning, huh?" he said, scratching behind one of the tiny horns. The hatchling chirped happily, clearly enjoying the attention. Its wings stretched a little, shaking off the stiffness from sleeping on the cold floor. Elias noticed how thin the dragon looked and frowned slightly. "You must be hungry," he said. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small ration bar from his shift meal. It wasn't anything special, just compressed nutrients meant for long work hours, but he broke off a piece and carefully offered it to the hatchling. The little dragon sniffed it cautiously before taking a small bite. Its eyes widened instantly, and it devoured the rest with surprising enthusiasm. Elias laughed quietly. "Guess that answers that." As the dragon happily finished the last crumbs, the distant sound of engines roared outside the corridor. Elias frowned and stood up, peeking toward the entrance of the service hallway. Through the rain he could see several armored transport vehicles pulling into the spaceport plaza, their lights flashing through the storm. Dozens of Imperial soldiers jumped out, spreading across the platforms in organized search patterns. Elias felt a small knot of worry tighten in his chest. Something serious was happening in the city tonight. He glanced back at the little dragon, who had suddenly pressed itself against his leg nervously. Its instincts clearly sensed the danger in the approaching noise. Elias knelt down again and placed a reassuring hand on its head. "Hey, it's all right," he whispered. "They're probably just looking for something." The hatchling looked up at him with wide golden eyes, clearly trusting his calm tone more than the chaos outside. What Elias still didn't understand was that those soldiers were searching specifically for the tiny creature standing beside him. The Imperial command had traced the heir's magical signature to this exact district, and the search teams were now closing in. If they found the hatchling here, protocol would demand immediate containment and return to the palace under heavy guard. But dragon heirs were known for forming deep emotional bonds with the first being who truly comforted them during moments of vulnerability. If the soldiers tried to separate the hatchling from Elias by force, the terrified young dragon might react unpredictably, and even a baby dragon could unleash devastating power when frightened. Outside, a squad of armored guards moved closer to the maintenance corridor entrance. Their commander held a glowing tracking device that pulsed brighter with every step. "The signal is very close," he said firmly. "Stay alert. The Imperial heir must be secured unharmed." The soldiers nodded, tightening their grips on their equipment. Meanwhile, inside the corridor, the hatchling suddenly let out a soft whimper and pressed itself tightly against Elias's side. Its scales faintly glowed with nervous energy. Elias looked down, surprised by the sudden fear in the creature's behavior. He listened carefully, and finally heard the approaching footsteps echoing through the metal hallways. He sighed quietly and scratched the dragon's head again. "You're really scared of something, aren't you?" he murmured. The hatchling nodded weakly, its wings trembling. Elias didn't know the full story, but his instincts told him one thing very clearly. Whatever had frightened this little dragon before had something to do with the people now searching the area. And until he understood the situation better, he wasn't about to let anyone drag the poor creature away while it was still shaking in fear. "All right," Elias said gently, standing up and picking up the jacket again. "How about we find a quieter place for a bit?" The hatchling immediately climbed back into the jacket, peeking out with hopeful eyes. Elias wrapped the fabric loosely around it and slipped quietly down a side maintenance stairway just as the first group of Imperial soldiers entered the corridor behind him. Above the storm clouds, the Dragon Emperor suddenly felt his child's magical signature move again. Still calm, still protected, but now traveling deeper into the city beside a strange second presence. A human one. Instead of anger, something unexpected stirred in the ancient ruler's heart. Curiosity. Whoever this human was, they had somehow done the impossible. They had comforted the heir of the Dragon Emperor so completely that the young dragon now refused to leave their side. And very soon, the entire empire would discover exactly who that human was. Dragon. Elias Carter moved quickly but carefully through the dim maintenance tunnels beneath the spaceport, the sound of distant boots echoing behind him as Imperial soldiers continued their search above. The old service stairway he had taken was rarely used, built decades earlier when the port first expanded, and most workers preferred the modern lifts instead. For Elias, however, the forgotten tunnels were familiar ground. He had repaired pipes and cables down here countless times, memorizing the maze-like paths that twisted beneath the massive docking towers. Inside his jacket, the tiny dragon hatchling peeked out with wide golden eyes, its small claws gripping the fabric while its wings trembled slightly. It was still frightened, but whenever Elias glanced down and whispered reassuringly, the little creature seemed to relax again. "Don't worry," he murmured quietly while stepping over a rusted maintenance rail. "We'll stay out of sight until things calm down." The hatchling responded with a soft chirp and pressed closer against his chest, clearly trusting him completely now. Above them, the situation in the city had grown even more intense. Imperial search teams had spread across the entire spaceport district, scanning every corridor and storage bay. Officers shouted orders while armored vehicles blocked exits, and dragon riders circled the skies like living shadows against the storm clouds. The royal command had confirmed it beyond any doubt. The missing dragon heir had last been sensed somewhere within this exact sector. To the Empire, losing the Dragon Emperor's only child was unthinkable. Entire armies would move if necessary. Yet, despite their overwhelming power, they were searching blindly for something that was already slipping quietly beyond their reach. In the tunnels, Elias paused beside a small service door and crouched down, opening his satchel again. "You must still be hungry," he said softly. The hatchling tilted its head curiously as he pulled out a small container of leftover meat strips he usually kept for long night shifts. As soon as the dragon smelled the food, its nose twitched eagerly. Elias laughed quietly. "Thought so." He offered a piece, and the hatchling happily nibbled it from his fingers, its tail wagging slightly with excitement. Watching the little creature eat so eagerly made Elias shake his head with amusement. "You know," he said casually, "for such a tiny dragon you've got quite the appetite." The hatchling chirped proudly, as if agreeing with him. For a moment, the tension of the night seemed to fade away entirely, replaced by the simple warmth of an unexpected friendship between a tired human mechanic and a lost dragon child. But far above the city, the Dragon Emperor had finally taken flight. His colossal crimson wings spread across the storm clouds like living thunder as he soared over the capital, his ancient eyes blazing with determination. Few beings in existence had ever seen the Emperor in motion. His power alone could shake mountains. Yet now that power was driven by something deeply personal, the desperate need to find his child. He closed his eyes briefly while flying, reaching out with ancient senses older than the Empire itself. Once again he felt the faint magical presence of the hatchling, and once again, something unusual surrounded it. The human presence was still there, steady and calm, almost like a protective shield. Instead of distress, the hatchling's energy felt comforted, safe. This confused the Emperor more than anything else. Dragons of royal blood did not trust easily, especially when frightened. And yet his child had clearly chosen to stay close to this unknown human. Back in the tunnels, Elias pushed open another metal door that led into an old cargo maintenance room. Dust covered most of the unused equipment inside, but it was dry and quiet, perfect for resting until the chaos outside settled down. "All right," he said gently while sitting down beside a crate. "This place should do." The hatchling climbed out of the jacket and stretched its wings again before wobbling slightly on its small legs. Elias watched carefully in case it needed help, but the dragon steadied itself and looked around the room curiously. A moment later it waddled over and bumped its head lightly against Elias's knee again, asking for attention. Elias chuckled and scratched under its chin. "You really like that, don't you?" The dragon chirped happily and curled up beside him. For several peaceful minutes, nothing disturbed them except the faint rumble of thunder outside the tunnels. Then suddenly the hatchling stiffened. Its ears perked up and its glowing scales flickered faintly. Elias noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. The dragon looked toward the ceiling as if sensing something far above them, something powerful. Elias didn't understand the meaning of the reaction, but the hatchling wasn't afraid this time. Instead, it seemed curious, almost excited. High above the city, the Dragon Emperor had finally pinpointed the location. His massive wings slowed as he hovered in the storm clouds, staring down toward the spaceport district. Deep beneath the metal towers, the magical signature of his child burned clearly now, and beside it was the unmistakable presence of the human who had been protecting the hatchling all night. The Emperor's ancient mind considered many possibilities. A kidnapper? Unlikely. The hatchling's emotional state felt too calm. A caretaker? Impossible. No official caretaker would hide from Imperial soldiers. That left only one explanation. A stranger who had chosen kindness. Instead of unleashing his terrifying power upon the district, the Dragon Emperor made an unexpected decision. He folded his wings and descended silently through the storm clouds toward the outer maintenance levels of the port. If this human had truly comforted his child, Then the emperor wanted to see them with his own eyes before the soldiers found them. Back in the dusty cargo room, Elias leaned back against the crate while the little dragon curled up beside him again. He sighed quietly, rubbing his tired eyes. "What a strange night," he muttered. The hatchling chirped softly in agreement and rested its head on his boot. Neither of them realized that the most powerful dragon in the entire empire was now only a few hundred meters above them, descending silently through the rain. Within minutes, the dragon emperor would arrive. And when he did, the quiet human mechanic who had comforted a crying dragon child would finally discover the truth about the little creature he had protected all night. Dragon. The quiet cargo maintenance room beneath the spaceport had fallen into a calm silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the soft breathing of the tiny dragon hatchling curled beside Elias Carter's boot. The little creature had finally relaxed after the long night of fear and confusion, its shimmering sapphire scales glowing faintly in the dim yellow light of the old ceiling lamp. Elias leaned back against a dusty crate, arms folded loosely, watching the small dragon sleep with a faint, tired smile. For someone who had started the night as a simple mechanic finishing his shift, the situation felt strangely unreal. Yet to him, the hatchling was not some legendary creature or symbol of power. It was simply a scared child that needed comfort. He scratched gently behind its tiny horn again, and the dragon stirred slightly before chirping softly in its sleep. Yeah, Elias murmured quietly. "I'll keep watch." But just as the peaceful moment settled, the air in the room suddenly changed. A deep vibration rippled through the metal walls, so low it could almost be mistaken for distant thunder. Except this sound carried something far heavier power. The hatchling's eyes snapped open instantly, glowing gold in the dim light. Instead of fear, however, its tail wagged excitedly, and it jumped to its feet with a happy chirp. Elias frowned in confusion. "What's gotten into you?" he asked, just as the heavy steel door at the far end of the maintenance room slowly creaked open by itself. Rain-scented wind drifted into the room, and a massive shadow stretched across the floor. Elias stood slowly, instinctively placing himself between the door and the small dragon. At first all he saw was darkness filling the doorway, but then two enormous glowing eyes appeared, burning crimson like living fire. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as an immense figure lowered its head through the opening. The creature that entered was easily 20 times the size of the hatchling, its scales dark red like molten stone and its wings folded against the walls of the corridor outside. Every movement carried ancient authority and terrifying strength. It was not simply a dragon, it was the Dragon Emperor himself. For several seconds Elias simply stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Every citizen of the empire knew the legends. The Dragon Emperor was older than the capital city itself, ruler of the dragon clans and one of the most powerful beings alive. Yet here he was, standing inside a dusty maintenance room like some silent mountain of living fire. Elias swallowed hard but didn't step away from the hatchling behind him. The Emperor lowered his massive head slightly, his glowing gaze shifting between the human mechanic and the small dragon beside him. Then something completely unexpected happened. The hatchling ran past Elias with a joyful chirp and leaped toward the Emperor's enormous claw, rubbing its head happily against the giant scales. The Dragon Emperor's expression softened instantly. The fearsome ruler gently lowered his claw, allowing the small dragon to climb onto it. For a moment the Emperor simply observed his child carefully, checking every detail, every movement, every breath. Then he lifted his gaze toward Elias again. "Human." The Dragon Emperor's voice echoed like distant thunder inside the chamber, deep and powerful yet strangely calm. "You protected my child." Elias blinked, stunned. "Your child?" he repeated quietly, glancing at the little dragon now perched proudly on the Emperor's claw. The hatchling chirped happily and flapped its wings as if introducing them. Realization slowly dawned across Elias's face. "Wait, you mean this little guy is—" The Emperor nodded once, a slow movement that made the entire room tremble slightly. "The only heir to the dragon throne." At that exact moment, Shouting voices echoed from the corridor outside as Imperial soldiers finally reached the maintenance level. Boots thundered closer, and several armored guards rushed into the doorway, only to freeze instantly when they saw the enormous crimson dragon inside the room. The commander dropped to one knee immediately. "Your Majesty!" the soldier gasped. "We were searching." The Emperor raised one massive claw, silencing the entire squad instantly. His gaze remained fixed on Elias. "While my armies searched the entire city in panic," the Dragon Emperor continued slowly, "you did something far more important. You comforted a frightened child." Elias rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well, he was crying," he said simply. "Anyone would have helped." The soldiers exchanged stunned glances. Anyone? No one in the Empire would dare approach a dragon heir without permission. Yet this ordinary human had done it without hesitation. The hatchling chirped again and jumped off the Emperor's claw, waddling back toward Elias before pressing its head affectionately against his leg. The Emperor watched the moment carefully, ancient eyes narrowing slightly. Not with anger, but with deep understanding. Dragon heirs formed bonds very rarely, and when they did, those bonds were nearly impossible to break. "It appears," the Emperor said slowly, "that my child has chosen you." Elias blinked again. "Chosen me for what?" The Emperor's massive wings shifted slightly, casting shadows across the walls. "For trust." Silence filled the room as the meaning settled over everyone present. The most powerful dragon ruler in the Empire had just acknowledged that his heir trusted a human mechanic more than any royal guardian. Finally, the Emperor spoke again. "Elias Carter," he said, somehow already knowing the human's name. "From this moment forward, you will no longer be merely a maintenance worker." The soldiers straightened nervously as the Emperor continued. "You will serve as protector and guardian to the dragon heir." Elias stared in disbelief. "Wait, what?" The hatchling chirped excitedly and climbed halfway up his leg as if fully approving of the decision. The Emperor's deep voice rumbled again. "You showed courage without knowing who my child was. You offered kindness without expecting reward. Such qualities are rarer than strength." He lowered his head slightly closer to Elias. "And the heir of dragons has already chosen you as family." The soldiers watched in stunned silence as the Emperor straightened to his full height again. Outside, the storm clouds were finally beginning to break, and the first light of dawn crept across the city skyline. In a single night, the life of a quiet human mechanic had changed forever. He had comforted a crying dragon child, completely unaware that the little creature was the future ruler of the Dragon Empire. And now, because of that simple act of kindness, Elias Carter stood at the beginning of a destiny no human had ever held before, guardian to the heir of the Dragon Emperor himself. Dragon. The first rays of morning sunlight broke through the fading storm clouds above the Imperial spaceport, casting golden light across the massive metal towers and landing platforms. Workers, soldiers, and merchants had begun gathering again, whispering nervously about the chaos of the night before. None of them yet understood what had truly happened beneath the port. Inside the maintenance corridor, however, the reality of the situation was still settling heavily on Elias Carter's shoulders. Just hours earlier, he had been nothing more than a tired mechanic finishing his shift, and now he stood face to face with the Dragon Emperor himself, while the Emperor's only heir clung happily to his leg like a playful child. The little dragon chirped proudly, its sapphire scales glowing in the soft morning light as it climbed onto Elias's shoulder and curled its tiny tail around his collar. Elias sighed quietly, rubbing his forehead as if hoping the situation might somehow turn out to be a dream. "Guardian to the dragon heir," he muttered to himself. "Yeah, that's going to take some getting used to." Across the room, the Dragon Emperor watched carefully. The ancient ruler's enormous crimson form filled most of the chamber, yet his massive wings were folded calmly, and the blazing intensity in his eyes had softened slightly since the moment he confirmed his child was safe. He studied Elias not with suspicion but with curiosity. Dragons had ruled alongside the Empire for thousands of years, yet rarely had one chosen a human companion willingly. That the heir had bonded so quickly with this mechanic fascinated the Emperor more than anything else. The hatchling, meanwhile, had already made its preference very clear. It refused to leave Elias's side even when Imperial attendants approached nervously. Whenever someone tried to pick it up, the tiny dragon simply chirped in protest and climbed back onto Elias again. The soldiers present in the corridor had now spread the news through their command network. Within minutes, more royal guards and advisors arrived, kneeling respectfully before the Dragon Emperor. Their armor gleamed under the rising sunlight as they waited for instructions. One of the Emperor's senior advisors, an elderly man with silver hair and a long ceremonial cloak, stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty," he said with a respectful bow. "The palace has been preparing for the heir's safe return. The royal chambers and dragon sanctum are ready." The advisor glanced briefly toward Elias, his expression uncertain. The Dragon Emperor noticed the hesitation immediately. "Speak freely," the Emperor rumbled. The advisor nodded slowly. "It is simply unusual, Your Majesty. The heir appears unwilling to separate from the human." The Emperor lowered his enormous head toward Elias and the hatchling. The tiny dragon immediately chirped happily and patted the Emperor's snout with its small claw before returning its attention to Elias's shoulder. The Emperor watched the interaction for a moment before letting out a deep, rumbling sound that almost resembled laughter. "Then the solution is simple," he said. "The human returns with us." The advisors exchanged surprised looks, but none dared question the Emperor's decision directly. Elias, however, raised a hand awkwardly. Your Majesty." The Emperor turned his gaze toward him. "Yes, Elias Carter?" Elias shifted slightly, trying not to disturb the dragon perched on his shoulder. "I appreciate the trust, but I'm just a mechanic. I fix cargo lifts and wiring systems. I don't exactly know anything about raising a dragon prince." The hatchling chirped again as if strongly disagreeing with that statement. It gently bumped its head against Elias's cheek, clearly pleased to remain where it was. The Dragon Emperor's glowing eyes softened again as he observed the moment. "You already understand the most important lesson," the Emperor replied calmly. "You treated my child not as royalty, not as a weapon, but as a frightened young life in need of comfort." He paused briefly before continuing. "Strength can be taught, discipline can be trained, but compassion must come naturally." Elias scratched the back of his neck awkwardly again. "I just helped a kid who was crying," he said quietly. The Emperor shook his massive head slightly. "No, human. You helped the future ruler of dragons." Outside the corridor, several massive royal air transports had already landed at the spaceport. Their polished hulls gleamed in the morning light while elite dragon riders circled overhead, guarding the area. The entire district had been secured by Imperial command. News of the heir's discovery was beginning to spread quickly through the capital city. Citizens gathered in small groups, wondering what had happened during the storm. None of them expected that the person standing beside the dragon heir was not a noble, a knight, or a royal mage, but a simple mechanic wearing a stained work uniform. Back in the maintenance chamber, the Dragon Emperor slowly extended one enormous claw toward Elias. "Come," he said calmly. "The palace awaits." Elias hesitated for a moment, glancing around the dusty room where the strangest night of his life had taken place. Then he looked at the hatchling sitting comfortably on his shoulder. The little dragon chirped and wagged its tail excitedly, clearly eager to go wherever Elias went. He sighed and shrugged slightly. "Well," he muttered, "I guess someone has to make sure you don't get lost again." The soldiers around them smiled quietly at the comment, though none dared laugh in front of the Emperor. With surprising gentleness for a creature of his size, the Dragon Emperor opened his wings and stepped aside, allowing Elias to walk toward the corridor exit first. The message was clear to everyone present. The human was no longer just another citizen. He now stood under the personal protection of the Dragon Emperor himself. As Elias stepped out into the bright morning light of the spaceport, he shielded his eyes briefly from the sun. Dozens of royal guards lined the landing platform, and the massive Imperial transport ship waited nearby. The hatchling chirped excitedly at the sight of the open sky and flapped its small wings. Elias chuckled softly. "Easy there, little prince," he said. "One adventure at a time." Above them, the Dragon Emperor spread his enormous wings and lifted into the air with a thunderous beat, soaring over the city skyline like a living mountain of crimson fire. Citizens across the capital stopped and stared in awe as their ancient ruler flew across the sky once more. But what they did not yet realize was that their emperor was not flying alone anymore. Far below him, walking up the ramp of the royal transport ship, was the human who had unknowingly comforted the dragon heir during the most frightening night of its young life. And from that moment forward, the quiet mechanic named Elias Carter would never again live an ordinary life. He had become the chosen guardian of the Dragon Emperor's only child, a bond forged not through power, but through a simple act of kindness on a rainy night. Dragon,